Welcome to Radical AI, a podcast about radical ideas, radical people, and radical stories at the intersection of ethics and artificial intelligence. We are your hosts, Dylan and Jess.
In this episode, we interview Unintended, a postdoc with Microsoft Research working with the FATE, which stands for Fairness, Accountability, Transparency, and Ethics in AI research group. Michael works at the intersection of human-computer interaction, AI, machine learning, and public interest technology, where he uses human-centered methods to understand how we might equitably co-design data-driven technologies in the public interest with impacted stakeholders. Michael, with other collaborators, authored the paper Co-Designing Checklists to Understand Organizational Challenges and Opportunities Around Fairness in AI, which is one of the major focuses of this interview.
Specifically related to that paper and beyond, in this interview we cover some of the following topics, including what does it mean to co-design technologies? What is a checklist when it comes to the field of AI ethics, and why is it so important? What's the problem with AI ethics principles released from large tech companies? Is there a problem, and how do we fix it? What are the limitations of using checklists for fairness, and what are the alternatives?
This interview is actually particularly special to Dylan and I because it has been in process for months now, and we actually started planning this interview before we even launched the podcast back in April. So Jen Wertman-Vaughn, who we recently had on the show, tweeted in January about how this paper was accepted to Chi and won one of the best paper awards. So after we read the paper, we just had to reach out to all of the different co-authors on the paper, including Hannah Wallach and Luke Stark, and of course, Unintended, who this interview is with, and it took quite a long time for all of us to finally get together just due to COVID craziness, but we are so excited that we finally got the scheduling figured out and were able to sit down and chat with Michael just about what the heck checklists really are. So without further ado, we are so excited to share this interview with Unintended with all of you.
We're on the line today with Unintended. Michael, how are you doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's great to have you here. I was wondering if we could just get started with a little bit of who you are and your story and your journey to the work that you're doing right now.
Absolutely. So I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Microsoft Research in our research group on fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics in AI. So my background by trainings, I have a PhD in human-computer interaction, but originally I was a teacher. I was a public school teacher for a number of years, and I kind of made my way obliquely into research and thinking about questions of access to technology for learning and teaching, and then thinking a little bit about how do we design those in human-centered ways involving students and teachers and parents. And then sort of widening the scope out, thinking a bit more broadly around questions of equity and ethics and fairness, which led me here to Microsoft Research.
And I saw before that you were a high school teacher in your previous career. So did that have anything to do with your interest in influencing people's access to data literacy and then also people's access to technology in general?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so as a public school teacher at the high school level, and at the time, so this was about 2012, I was realizing that children were coming to school with more and more technology and had access to it at home, and so wanted to think about how could we actually use these to allow students to continue learning on their own and pursue learning in different ways. And as a teacher, wanting to use those to improve my teaching also. So that led me into computer science and HCI research. But I think one of the questions that for me, like as I went back to grad school, I went through a master's program and then to a PhD, I kept running into these questions like, well, how do we design these education technology systems in a way that gives learners some agency and some control over their learning and over the kinds of technologies that are used in their learning process? And are there some technologies that may be harmful or may not be beneficial or that students might not want, even if they might have, if they improve their learning outcomes on a test? if the way that they go about doing that is undesirable or is inequitable or maybe allows some students to perform better than others, what are these sort of larger unintended consequences?
So when we ask people, their stories every time on the show, like every episode, and the one thing that we've learned is that there's no pattern, right? So like everyone comes on and is like, I have a really unique story about how I got here. And that's the case for you as well, coming in from a second career. And I myself also came in from a second career that someone might think is totally disconnected from this AI ethics or responsible tech space. But actually there's a lot of skills that are transferable. And so I'm wondering, before we get really a deep dive into your research, if you could talk a little bit for those folks out there who maybe are teachers right now in the public school system who are looking to get into the responsible tech or AI ethics field, like talk a little bit about either what that journey was like or maybe like what barriers, but also what gifts you think that first career has brought into this work for you.
Absolutely. I think for me, it was a lot of reading and following some academics and looking at who was doing the work that was inspiring to me, and then thinking about what I would be excited about doing in the short term. So initially, I actually went into grad school thinking, okay, I'll come out, I'll work at an ed tech company or be a sort of like learning engineer at a school system, and then realizing that like in this process of taking courses on technology design and education technology, sort of opening up all of these other lines of questions. And for me as a teacher, so coming in having read Paulo Freire and this idea of learners being drivers of the learning process, right? Active participants, that they're not just sort of these like empty receptacles or banks to be filled with knowledge. And then sitting in on some of the like courses where some of the rhetoric around learning is sort of so very much this idea that learners, that there is this sort of content that learners need to know, and this technology will sort of disseminate it to the learners. So this sort of tension, and I think also this very techno-deterministic view of learning, that if we have technology, if we have a problem, we can solve it with the technology that we have at hand, right? The sort of like hammer and nail idea. Like if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you have an algorithm, everything looks like it's a problem that can be solved with an algorithm. And quite frankly, that's often not the case. And I think for you were asking about like what was helpful. I think awareness of the larger social system and political and historical legacies and issues and factors in education specifically, I think was so helpful and gave me such a helpful perspective in conversations around ed tech and technology design.
So one of the reasons why we wanted to talk to you specifically is because of this amazing paper that you and your colleagues in the FATE group had published entitled Co-Designing Checklists to Understand Organizational Challenges and Opportunities Around Fairness and AI, right, in AI, which is a lot of really great words, but is also a lot of words. Part of this conversation is just breaking that down. But before we dive into the paper itself, I was wondering if you could talk about checklists. Because checklists, it's been this word that Jess and I have heard from a lot of folks about whether they're good or bad or whether there are too many of them. And sometimes I feel like those of us kind of who are in the echo chamber forget to even frame like what the heck a checklist is in the first place and why did it exist, why is it a framework, etc. Could you just say like a checklist 101 in terms of AI ethics and AI fairness? Like what do we mean when we say checklist?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to answer your question in kind of a roundabout way, and maybe help give some perspective on what motivated some of this research. So about 5 years ago now, in between a master's program and a PhD program, I was doing this data science for social good fellowship out of Georgia Tech in the city of Atlanta, where we were working with the Atlanta Fire Rescue Department to help them use some of their data to improve access to fire inspection and other types of services. And as part of that, and then after that fellowship, when I was in my PhD at CMU, I and others I was working with were thinking about, well, how do these types of civic data reduce or contribute to inequities in access to these kinds of services, right? Like which communities are prioritized in getting access to fire safety inspection services, or which ones have historically been overlooked for various reasons, right? And how does that show up in the data? And this is something that the partners we worked with at the fire rescue departments in both Atlanta and in Pittsburgh raised as issues. Like certain communities, wealthier communities, may have more robust data available, and thus the models might be better able, might be more accurate because there's more data available, and thus with more accurate models, the services might be better prioritized, or might be able to pick up on various risk factors for building fire risk and things like that. So that was a couple of different projects, a couple of different questions. But the reason why I bring it up is because as we're going through this process, and as the data analysts from the city governments, from the fire departments, were working with our HCI and machine learning and data science teams, we kept running these questions of like, well, how do we think about these, how historical inequities are become perpetuated through predictive models, through the kinds of data that we have access to, right? So these kinds of questions that have been percolating over the last 5 years, and one thing we were running into, like, well, there are these principles, and certainly now in the last 2 or 3 years, there are many principles and value statements for what makes ethical AI or equitable or fair AI, but and others have pointed out this disconnect too, that these principles are often at such a high level of abstraction that in the day-to-day practice for a data scientist or a machine learning engineer, they're often difficult to operationalize, difficult to put into practice. And so a friend and colleague of mine, Ken Holstein, who did an internship at Microsoft Research the summer before I was there in 2018, him and Hannah Wallach and Jen Wortman-Vaughn and others at Microsoft Research did some work with AI industry practitioners where they realized that many teams often only realized they had issues with their products being inequitable or unfair after the products were out and deployed in the world. And that's, even with having principle statements and value statements for what fair systems might mean, because in the day-to-day, the nitty-gritty of choosing which data sets, how you process those data sets, right? Decisions, these sort of micro design decisions that data scientists and ML engineers are making at each step of the process might introduce or compound or simply overlook issues of equity. And so to kind of circle back to that example with the fire rescue department, the Atlanta Fire Rescue Department, we were working with them, had access to a commercial real estate data set, which had information, for instance, about sprinklers in various properties. And that contributed to making a predictive model of building fire risk more accurate. And this seems great, except that that data set was only available for a subset of properties. If you have to guess, you might guess which communities have access to this kinds of data, and often historically it's wealthier communities, and there are again historical inequities in which in marginalized communities or impoverished communities having lack of access to public services and thus less data sets to train models on. So, right, it's just one example of a place in the process where decisions might either overlook historical equity issues or not. Sorry, so it's maybe a long-winded way of circling around to your question of why checklists, right? So you have principle statements, but during the process, it's difficult to identify decision points and choices that need to be made. So we look to other fields where these types of complex decisions get made in high stakes fields, like in medicine, like in aviation, structural engineering, where they use checklists for a variety of purposes. So these are also used in software engineering as well, but for perhaps different purposes. So let me zoom up a little bit. There are different types of checklists that either serve as like a memory aid to remind people to do certain things, like is the landing gear down? Are your flaps raised? Right, these sorts of things for an aviation context. Or in surgical safety, the World Health Organization has put out checklists for instance, for an anesthesiologist and a surgeon prior to inducing anesthesia, anticipating potential risks or harms to that particular patient, making sure that, one, they're just confirming, like, is this the right patient and the right procedure for this patient, these types of things. But those assume a set of known risks and known steps in the process. And the checklist in those cases serves this role, I mentioned, of memory aid, reminding the practitioners to complete some set of tasks. And I actually think for fairness and ethics in AI, it's not quite as simple or straightforward. And I think there is a risk of treating fairness and ethics and equity as this fully mapped and known space, and we can reduce it to a set of just binary yes/no questions that are just meant to remind people of things that they should probably already know. When actually it's significantly more complex than that. Each sociocultural context might have unique factors. Different groups of stakeholders might actually fundamentally disagree on what the intended outcome is. Everybody likes to throw around AI for good, but what does good mean? Good for whom? And who's defining that? So as we were discussing and reading and getting literature reviews on these, the ways that checklists get used in other fields, we recognize that there are some fields that are highly complex and highly situated and like locally determined. So for instance, structural engineering, checklists in structural engineering are often used to structure communication between different teams or different members of the team involved. And that might be because soil conditions are different than expected when the blueprint was drawn up, or and maybe the foundation isn't quite sitting at the right level than as they expected when they drew the plans up. So a checklist in that case might connect maybe the engineers who are developing the foundation with people doing a survey of the soil composition and things like that. So the idea was that if for AI design and fairness specifically, checklists might serve a similar role to coordinate communication, to make sure that certain conversations between team members, across teams, between teams and stakeholders that have an interest in the particular problem or are impacted by the systems, that those conversations take place.
What I'm wondering then is, if we're talking about like the domain specificity of different checklists, and then we talk about AI as one of those domains, I see so many different subdomains of AI. And so how do you make a checklist for, quote, AI fairness that would work for like medical procedures, loan approval or denial, recommendation, fire department resource allocation? Like, is it one checklist? Is it 10 checklists? How does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. And so let me, I guess, kind of walk you through a little bit of what we did. So kind of starting with that as the motivation for the research. So this was work we did last summer in 2019. And we worked with about 48 practitioners from a variety of different organizations, tech companies, et cetera, in a variety of roles. So some of these, yes, were data scientists and ML engineers, but others were designers or researchers or even product managers, program managers, consultants, or even we also talked with some people who do annotation work or the sort of content editing or labeling work that goes into some of the data. And in part, we wanted to investigate, well, what are their existing processes for thinking about issues of fairness in their products and their systems, what role they might envision checklists might play, but also what concerns they would have about checklists in their work. And then we conducted co-design sessions, and of course, if it's design, it involves post-it notes. So we broke down an AI lifecycle onto a sort of a wall and had post-its where people could add suggestions for what should go onto the checklist and at which stage or what phase of the lifecycle, and then comment on other people's and suggest others for deletion. And so what we ended up with at the end of the summer research and what we ended up publishing, and we did publish the actual final checklist that resulted from these design sessions as a supplement to the paper, is something that could be adapted or customized by different teams. And I think, Jess, you're right on that. We, as a group of researchers, wouldn't presume to develop a checklist that would be appropriate for every single domain, for every single use case or application area. We had participants from computer vision, from natural language and speech systems, from search and information retrieval systems, and other sort of classification models, different types of models, different types of use cases, and in part to probe on what some of these edge cases might be, like which types of prompts or questions in a checklist might not work at all for your domain or for their domain. But at the end of the day, this will need to be customized, or different teams, different application areas will need to develop some type of guided process, or at least the version that we put together would need to be customized by different teams. And this is equally true for the medical domain, for aviation as well. And there's not just one medical checklist, right? There's some for surgical safety, for procedures with anesthesia. There's some for intradialytic hypertension, right? For various procedures. And same for aviation, for different steps in the process. There's routine checklists, there's emergency checklists, and even different airlines have their own. So this is something that we saw when we were doing the literature review, that when airlines merge, when different companies merge, one critical challenge is how do they merge their aviation safety checklists, and which items are appropriate for different models of aircraft, right, or for the unique cultural and social dynamics of that particular airline, of pilots and co-pilots and how they work for that particular airline versus another. And so these social and cultural factors were certainly things on our mind, and certainly things we were trying to uncover through the research we were doing too.
You have me sold on checklists, but there are a lot of people who are not necessarily sold on checklists, and I imagine that part of the background info and one of the reasons why and motivations for this paper is because the even idea of a checklist is still there's energy around it, right? And so I'm wondering what is the research that this paper was in conversation with, and for people who take issue with even the concept of a checklist for AI ethics specifically, like what is that side of the argument?
Yeah, absolutely. And in part, this was responding to several organizations, some companies, some government agencies putting out checklists of their own for data science ethics, for AI ethics, and recognizing that as well-intentioned as they were, they often treated ethics and fairness as this binary yes/no sort of thinking, binary thinking, but also treated it as an individual problem and as an individual's responsibility. That is, so an individual data scientist might look up this particular company's checklist or government agencies checklist and go through it on their own and address these issues. It's framed as this individual issue. But others in HCI research, so Colin Gray is one researcher who has done quite a bit of work on user experience practitioners and how they think about and grapple with ethical tensions and ethical responsibilities in organizational contexts. And so actually this is one thing that we found in our research also, is that many of the people we spoke with recognized that there were risks to fairness, that there were potential biases and societal issues that were amplified or reproduced in their systems. I mean, this is sort of part of the zeitgeist now. But many of them articulated that right now in their organizations, the burden was on the individual to speak up, to say, hey, I think there's an issue here. I think our system might not perform as well for people of color or for women, et cetera, et cetera. And with that individual responsibility to speak up, there were often social costs and consequences. Either it was the same member of the team who felt like they were always the one to bring up ethical or questions of fairness. Often marginalized members of the teams who felt that they were tokenized by their organizations, and those social dynamics had often our participants felt that they had career costs. If they were always the person who wanted to slow down, we can't ship this product yet because we have to evaluate its disparate impact or its disparate performance for different groups. Well, that's going to cost their company money if they're not shipping that product, or if they have to collect new data and target data collection from different subpopulations. So our participants felt that having some kind of organizational framework, organizational infrastructure, some kind of guided process, and that is where we were trying to target with the checklist. That would be something that would give members of teams some framework to latch onto and say, well, wait, when we're in this meeting here, in our design spec meeting, have we asked these questions? Have we considered how our system might perform worse or for different groups of people, or have disparate harm or benefit for different groups? Have we met with stakeholders from those populations, from those communities? Have we solicited their input? Have we asked them, do they even want this system to exist at all? And just having some set of questions, some set of checks that structure those conversations at these different moments. What in the medical checklist research has been called these pause points. So before inducing anesthesia, you pause and you confirm these things. Before incision, you confirm these things. And so we, through this research, identified with practitioners what some of these points might be, like when they were first putting their system design specs together and their plans for data collection, and before they launch or before they ship the product, and then what sort of ongoing review might there be. But so I think, sorry, all of that to say that for us, for the practitioners, having some framework would help catch issues that might not otherwise be caught in the process. But there is, I think, this concern for our participants, for us, for others in the field, that a checklist, in either by the name or the way it's designed, might reinforce this binary thinking, might reinforce this sort of procedural thinking, like, okay, we know what the risks to ethics and fairness are. Let's just go down the list and check them off. And if we have all the boxes checked, then we're good. When that's almost certainly likely not to be the case.
Yeah, that's actually, thank you for specifying that, because my next question for you is going to be, well, does this mean people just get to check off a box that says, like, all right, all these boxes were checked, so check on fairness? But it's clear that that's not exactly the case. And what I'm wondering if for you actually is, it seems like it would be really ideal to incorporate within the machine learning development lifecycle, as you were saying before, like, before doctors put anesthesia on their patients, they have this set of checklists that they need to check off. And if the same were true with machine learning development, that would be really amazing. And now we have this set of things that can be checked off that are really great to include in the machine learning lifecycle to help with these concerns for fairness. So how do we get those enacted in the teams and the development teams that are creating these models and who are making and building this AI? So how do we go basically from theory and this wonderful paper that has been written to practice and basically enact all of the work that was done and make it happen?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that is a crucial question, and I think it's an open one. I would say in part that these are the recognition that these are sociotechnical issues, right? That even though the models themselves, the data used, like those are technical aspects of these systems, but those systems exist in social contexts, in social settings, where even if with your training data and your test data, you haven't identified any performance differences, okay, well, once humans out in the world are using this, the use of this system might lead to inequities or might lead to differential harm or benefits for different groups. You can also imagine a language system that in isolation, if it's generating language, doesn't the developers, the designers might not identify issues, but once it's out in the world and people are interacting with, maybe it's a chatbot or a language generating model, and people are contributing to it, then it might respond in biased ways. When you look at things like GPT-3, for instance, right? This language generation system that people are trying out and probing on and surfacing some of these biases present in the underlying language model. So I think that's one example. There's others of chatbots that have become sexist and racist or produce sexist and racist language after people were interacting with them. So I think there's many, many things that cannot possibly be anticipated prior to deployment. I think the goal for us, and this is a longer term goal, is how do we support teams in anticipating as many of these types of harms as possible prior to deployment? And so there's research and methods from user experience, from HCI, from design, things like speculative design and critical design that are intended to engender this kind of future-focused thinking of like, what could go wrong here? And even some like academic conferences are requiring authors to be pessimistic and not just have these sort of rose-tinted glasses. So in the ACM, the Association for Computing Machinery, there was a group that called for essentially this sort of removing the rose-tinted glasses and encouraging researchers, but also product designers to be a little bit pessimistic. There's others like Casey Feisler out of CU Boulder and some others who are working on this kind of speculative ethics. Like, how do you, so she's referred to these as Black Mirror writers workshops. So how do technologists kind of anticipate all the ways their systems could go wrong? And so I think it's going to be some combination of the two, right? Of technology designers in combination with stakeholders who are impacted by these systems and working together in this sort of co-design and participatory design process while systems are being developed to anticipate the ways they could go wrong and flag potential harms, and then ensuring that there is ongoing monitoring, ongoing review of systems once they're deployed, that it's not just left up to like the telemetry of scraping data of model performance and these sort of business metrics like revenue and speed and things, and maybe even accuracy, but that actually your conducting maybe more human-centered or more qualitative evaluations of these systems out in the field, in the wild.
Yeah, this definitely hits close to home for me because, as you already know, Casey is one of my co-advisors for my PhD program, and I love her Black Mirror's Writer's Room exercise. We'll link that in the show notes for this episode. And so based off of that, actually, I'm wondering if you see, realistically, pragmatically, but also maybe optimistically, if you see companies like Amazon, Facebook, Google, the top 5-10 tech companies and their machine learning teams sitting down in a room and speculating with each other about the harms of their machine learning technologies and wanting to incorporate a checklist like this. Like, do you optimistically see that happening?
I would love to. I would love to see tech companies both introducing slowness or caution into as a value into their design process, right? That they should stop, pause, and solicit input, get perspectives that they might not have on their teams prior to shipping, prior to launching. I think maybe the cynical side of me recognizes that large companies in a capitalist society are driven by profit incentives, and maybe one way to shift the model, shift the conversation, I think that there may be a couple of ways. One might be top down, either regulation or standards. So there are standards in other fields. There are these sort of processes and policies in other fields. Certainly, the FDA, right? And you could imagine, and others have called for. I think the AI Now Institute has been one of them, and others have called for similar types of regulatory bodies for algorithms, for machine learning and AI systems. And of course, there's questions like, well, would that sort of live in its own separate agency? Would that be distributed across the different domains that these models and systems work within? How do we, and I suppose we maybe more broadly, how do people in communities impacted by the systems affect change for those and prompt that sort of regulation standard? And so that, I think, is where maybe the other lever, the other side, is this bottom-up pressure, whether that is bottom-up pressure just from society at large to critique companies that go wrong. And you can see instances of this with data journalists, and ProPublica is one great example, and certainly in authors and people writing about these issues, right? Sophia Noble and Ruha Benjamin and many, many others that I think has sort of popularized the awareness of these issues. And you're starting to see the public responding to that and criticism of large tech companies. I think it remains to be seen the extent to which that criticism translates into actual meaningful change, and not this sort of just ethics washing, where companies might, yes, they'll put out a principle statement, or they might have publicly announced that they have an ethics board or something, but it's not clear how that actually leads to meaningful change in their design process and in the products themselves. And that bottom-up pressure might come from just the public, or might come from people within the organizations. And you see movements like Tech Won't Build It and No Tech for ICE, and some of these tech worker coalitions and tech worker organizing to either go on strike to protest decisions from their companies, or targeting at universities. So at my university, at Carnegie Mellon, there's a student group called No Tech for ICE that would increase awareness of which tech companies are contributing to ICE. And so I think that's one other bottom-up pressure.
That's one of the things that we absolutely love about this paper and about your work on checklists is because it does get to the heart of this urgency around AI ethics. And one of the things I've been struck by in this conversation has been the checklists that you're comparing to and drawing from on research. Like you're going straight to the medical world, and you're going straight to airplane design and things like life and death checklists, essentially, like literally, right? And then comparing it to the AI ethics checklists. And so I'm wondering for you, what is the urgency here in terms of AI ethics? And we've talked around it a little bit, but in terms of like putting a finer point on why are those the checklists that you went to in terms of what is important here when we start designing for AI ethics, and really what's at stake?
Yeah, I think the stakes are incredibly high as AI systems are used to drive decisions in everything from who gets access to medical care to which communities receive which types of public services at what priority, whether that is, for instance, in the case of like fire inspections and community risk reduction, other examples of like housing rights, right? And tenants' rights organizations advocating against computer vision and facial recognition systems being set up. So this is in Brooklyn, for instance, in one public housing project, they were using the housing project was using computer vision or facial recognition to determine who was granted access and not. And certainly with all of the issues in facial recognition being less accurate for people of color and women in particular, very like even determine like who actually gets to go inside their house and the surveillance of people, and particularly marginalized communities and historically over surveilled, over policed communities, that AI systems can exacerbate those issues, and they cover them with this sort of veneer of objectivity that even whether if the decisions made prior to the algorithms may have been biased themselves already, but now, there's an algorithm involved. Oh, it's data-driven, it's evidence-driven. This is like the rhetoric people use, right? Then, if it's decisions made by a machine, it must be trustworthy. And that's certainly not the case. So I would argue that the domains that they're being used in are high stakes, and the opacity, I think, is a critical issue, that decisions are made that shape people's lives that those people don't have access to and often are not able to contest or have recourse to.
So I think it's fairly clear at this point that these technologies are incredibly powerful. And I want to take us back actually to something you said at the beginning of the interview, and that your original research in this space was to design HCI systems that empower the users. And that was even something that was brought up a bit in this checklist paper too, shifting that power from the model and the engineer back towards the end user and those who are most negatively impacted, especially the vulnerable communities. So do you, first of all, how do you define the word radical as we talk about power, and you're on the Radical AI podcast? And do you think that this work that you're doing with checklists is radical?
So yeah, I love that question. I think for me, radical means starting with people first, valuing people over profit. And that could take a lot of different forms. That could take the form of questioning whose voices are involved in designing technology and AI systems specifically, and how historically marginalized groups of people might contribute to shaping those systems, and what form that takes. So I've been thinking a lot lately about this question of power and organizational power, right? Because I think in a research context, in HCI research, we love to promote human-centered design and participatory design, participatory research. But in practice, in large tech companies and in organizations, often people are involved at the end of the process. So they're they're consulted, right? A technology is built, an algorithm is built, and it's given to some group of users, stakeholders, and they're consulted in their opinion of it, rather than bring them in early, often giving them the power to refuse. Like, what would it mean for a group of students to say, no, I don't want a online learning platform that tracks my eye movements, for instance, to determine where my attention is. Am I paying attention to the reading or the teacher or these sorts of things? And this is a type of system model that exists. These are out there, right? These are being commercialized. So I think for me, and I think going back to my experiences in education and as a teacher, the reality of it is that the dimensions, the dynamics of political power, of social power, are such that historically disempowered groups are still not given a meaningful voice in the design of technologies that will impact them. And I think it's both a question of methods, of how do we do this, and that I think is where there is significant work in HCI, in the research community. But I also do really think it's organizational too, and that is really one undercurrent underneath the checklist work and the larger research program around this work is well, what does it mean for the organizations to shift their thinking and how do, and I think that is the radical piece. I'd like to think that that's the radical piece of some of this work, is introducing this friction into the design process, opening up opportunities for stakeholders' voices, for community voices in the design process, making it not just acceptable but actually valued for people on the design teams to raise a flag and raise awareness of potential risks or threats to fairness and equity. And to bring in stakeholders, and again, just going back that making it acceptable, making it a part of the process to have an exit ramp and say, look, we thought this was a good idea to build this thing, but after considering these potential harms, after talking with the people who might be impacted by it, not just the user, if it's if maybe not just the teacher, right? If it's an educational technology, but students, parents, others involved in their lives, and say, all right, well, we thought it was a good idea. We've invested all this time, but we shouldn't build this because it would actually cause more harm than it would help.
As we move towards wrapping up this interview, first, we were just wondering if you could tell listeners where they can find out more about your research and about you if they wanted to connect. And then second, I was curious if there was one thing that you had wished that you had known when you started this journey into AI ethics, what that might be.
So I think when I started the journey into, quote, AI for social good and data science for social good, I think I would have wanted to have a more holistic view of the theories, of methods, of what that actually means. Maybe to take a more skeptical view, I think. I think going back to the idea of the rose-tinted glasses, right? As a former teacher, and then going into computer science and HCI and then data science, machine learning, and think, oh wow, these technologies are so cool. They could do so much good. Let's build them. At the time, I would have wanted. Now looking back, I think I had been a little bit more skeptical of the premises and reached out a little bit more beyond the fields of data science, of machine learning, into some of these more interdisciplinary fields like philosophy, like science technology studies, and others, certainly sociology and some of the domain areas impacted by some of these fields. So I think that's certainly one piece. Yeah. And yeah, so you're welcome to check out. So that was maybe a little bit of a downer to end on, but I do think it's part of the journey that I've been on the last 5, 6, 7 years in research has been kind of moving through and within different communities, and I have been so excited and inspired at all of the amazing work that's happening in the research community and within some tech companies, and I think especially here at Microsoft, I acknowledge that I am biased because I am working here, but I did come here for the postdoc for a reason, because I think that that this lab is doing some really exciting stuff, and I am really thrilled and grateful to be a part of it. So I would encourage you to check out the Microsoft Research labs more generally, and then specifically the FATE research group. And yeah, there's lots of exciting, cool work going on around the socio-technical understanding of how fairness is thought about and incorporated into AI design.
And for you specifically, is there a website or a Twitter account or something you would like to plug for folks who want to follow up with you personally?
Sure, yeah, you can find my website on michaelmadeo.com. And I can send that over to you for the show notes as well.
We'll be sure to include all of that. And from skepticism to optimism, thank you so much, Michael, for sharing it all. It's really been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
We again want to thank Michael Madaio for sharing with us his expertise on the subject matter of checklists and so much more. But as we begin this debrief, I was wondering, Jess, if we could talk some more about checklists, because I find checklists fascinating. What do you think about checklists, Jess?
Yeah, let's talk about checklists. Checklists are so fascinating, and it's funny because the word doesn't really sound super sexy. Like, it's a checklist, but it's really interesting in the field of AI ethics, especially in this paper that Michael was telling us about, because the way that they created this checklist was different than so many other checklists that I've made. And also, for those who are listening, maybe keep a count of how many times we say the word checklist in this debrief, because I assume it's going to be a lot. But I think the thing that I'm immediately grappling with right now at the end of this interview is something that Michael was actually saying towards the end there, and that's how important it is to get feedback from the people who use and are impacted by AI systems before making decisions about how to design them. And that was what was so interesting about this paper, is that they had these participatory design workshops and these co-design sessions with people who are actually impacted and harmed by the technology before creating these checklists and these guidelines for the technologists. And it makes me wonder how different technology, and especially AI, would be if every single time we made an algorithm, we talked to the people that the algorithm was going to impact before even thinking about designing and creating it.
And I think part of why it gets lost, like when that user-centric experience that we're trying to design for, or that artificial intelligence systems or even entire companies that these checklists are trying to express values for, right, to inform the development of these systems. I think where it gets lost is actually in the fact that it's trying to express values and at this like high level of abstraction, right? It's like when you're designing a checklist for your like to go grocery shopping, right? It's like pretty specific. You know, you're going to get bananas, you're going to get eggs, you're going to get milk, right? But if you add like bananas, eggs, milk, fairness, right, as the fourth thing that you're going to pick up from the grocery store, it's a lot harder to actually get that fourth thing. And so then it's a question of like, what do you do? I mean, in order for it to be like a one-page checklist, like functionally, you need it to be abstract enough where it can cover some ground, right? It can't be that specific. And at the same time, you need some level of specificity so it has some level of teeth to it, or at least some ability to communicate what you need and actually allow engineers or developers or whoever to is those values in a real world thing. So it's not just ethics washing, it's not just marketing for ethics, but it's actually, okay, here's our values and here is how we're going to apply these values into the work that we're doing. But that's the hardest part, right?
Oh my gosh, I love that grocery store checklist example. I wish that we had started off the episode with that actually, because that actually makes checklists make so much more sense in my head. Of course, it's obvious. We use checklists in our everyday lives. It may be a little bit more difficult to understand when we apply it to, AI engineering and design, but it's definitely the same idea. And this is something I was thinking about a lot while Michael was speaking, especially in the AI ethics community. I feel like we have this tendency to really think abstractly abstractly and vaguely about the ethical issues that come up with AI technologies, which isn't necessarily a bad thing because it allows more people to join the community and join the conversation. But if we're talking about issues of racism and sexism and oppression, and we continue to keep these problems at this vague, high level of abstraction, as Michael said earlier in the interview, then what does that give to engineers? All they're going to do is just get angry at the AI ethics community for saying, well, okay, we get it. Like, you're angry, you're pissed at us for coding what we're coding, but what do we do? All we know is just to sit down in front of this computer and write lines of code and to, take the data and make the model and tune the model and optimize and test it. So where in that pipeline do your levels of abstraction and critique on the ethical conundrums of AI fit into the pipeline that we currently work with in our day-to-day lives and in our jobs? And that's what I love about checklists too, is because it takes those values, like you were saying, it takes that fairness checkbox, and instead of just saying, make it fairer, make it less sexist, make it less racist, it's saying, no, follow these steps, do these guidelines that we laid out, and start to think intentionally about the systems that you're creating.
Yeah, I do think that one thing that came out in this interview with Michael, too, though, is that not all checklists are created equal, right? Like, there are some checklists that are designed to do certain things, and there are other checklists designed to do other things. And so as much as we want all of our industry checklists to be these things that are really helpful and not just smoke and mirrors and, like, actual embodiment of values, they're not all like that, right? And I think that we need to hold these companies to high standards to not just have these checklists, right? Because it's easy to talk about fairness, and it's a whole nother thing to actually design around fairness and implement it. And I think that's where public policy comes into play, and where responsibility and accountability come into play. And really, for all of us who want to get in the heads of these companies and their checklists, I think we can all engage in a pretty easy thought experiment of just like naming what our values are, right? Like, it could be really tough to just name what our core values are as humans, as people in the world, and then to actually think about, okay, well, if I were to list those out and talk about like how I operationalize those values, like, that's a hard exercise. That's like a hard thing to do, which doesn't mean we shouldn't hold those companies accountable to do it, but it does mean that it's difficult. There's a lot of moving parts here.
Yeah, I'll even take your challenge one step further, Dylan, and I will say, I'm going to call out right now any engineers and data scientists who are listening to this episode. I encourage and invite all of you to challenge yourselves the next time that you are dealing with a data set or creating a model or tuning a model or testing or whatever it is that you're doing at your job. Don't think of those rows of data as numbers to optimize for, but think about them as people. And recognize that what you're optimizing for might not necessarily just be a number on a screen, but it might mean someone's livelihood. And consider how what you do with your code might impact someone in their real life.
For more information on today's show, please visit the episode page at radicalai.org.
If you enjoyed this episode, we invite you to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or your favorite podcatcher. Join our conversation on Twitter at RadicalAIPod. Tune into our episodes weekly on Wednesdays. And, as always, stay radical.